Sihon, the king of the Amorites. The crushing of those concealed in the caves of the mountain at Arnon was only the beginning of the miracles God wrought for Israel during their conquest of the land. It was at Arnon, too, that Sihon, the king of the Amorites, and his people, who hardly a month after Aaron's death rushed on Israel, were completely destroyed by them. This Amorite king, and likewise Og, the king of Bashan, were sons of Ahiah, whose father, Shemhazzai, was one of the fallen angels. In accordance with his celestial origin, Sihon was a giant whom no one could withstand, for he was of enormous stature, taller than any tower in the world, his thigh bone alone measuring 18 cubits, according to the big cubit of that time. In spite of his huge size, he was also fleet of foot, wherefore he was called Sihon, colt, to indicate the speed at which he moved, for his true name was Arad. Moses was very afraid of waging war against this giant, but God put Sihon's and Og's guardian angels in chains, and then said to Moses, "Behold, I have begun to deliver Sihon and his land to you. Begin to possess it, that you may inherit his land." For indeed, after the angels of Sihon and his people had fallen, Moses had nothing more to fear, for his enemies were delivered into his hands. God assured Moses he would begin to put his dread and fear on the people under the whole heaven, by making the sun stand still during the war against Sihon, that the world might see that God battled for Moses. Moses now asked if he might, before waging war, send ambassadors to Sihon requesting him to permit Israel to pass through the land. God replied, "What? I commanded you, rise up, contend with him in battle, and begin to possess his land. And you want to send him messengers of peace?" Moses, however, replied, "I want only to follow your example. When you wanted to lead Israel out of Egypt, you sent me to Pharaoh with the message to let Israel go, even though you could have consumed all Egypt with one flash of lightning. When you revealed the Torah, you offered it to the heathens for acceptance before giving it to Israel." God saw the justice of Moses' words and commanded him never in the future to declare war on a city before previously urging the people to surrender in peace. Moses then sent a note to Sihon requesting him to let Israel pass, promising that he would see to it that the people would travel along the king's highway, so that he had no fear of any violence on married women or seduction of girls. "We will even pay for the water that is otherwise given freely, and likewise buy food from you at good prices," Moses added. This letter to Sihon contained at its close also the communication that the Israelites would bring war on Sihon in case he did not permit them to pass through. Moses' assumption, however, that Sihon might permit Israel to pass through sounded in Sihon's ears like a summons to the keeper of a vineyard to permit someone else to harvest it. Sihon's answer, therefore, was as follows: "I and my brother Og received tribute from all the other Canaanite kings, to keep their enemies from accessing their lands. And now you ask me to give you free access to Canaan?" War between Sihon and Moses ensued, and ended in a brilliant victory for Israel. Sihon and his son, who equaled him in strength, found their death in this battle. God had brought it to pass that Israel had no need of laboriously waging war on one city after another in Sihon's land, for he brought all the hosts of this Amorite king together in Heshbon. When this city and the hosts within it were destroyed, all the rest of Sihon's land lay open before them. Israel's victory was all the more marvelous because Heshbon was an exceptionally well-fortified city, so that, had mosquitoes been its inhabitants, it could not have been captured by mortal means, much less so when defended by the hero Sihon and his heroic warriors. This victory was made possible only by the fact that God visited them with convulsions so terrible that they rolled and writhed in pain, unable to stand in the battle lines, so that Israel could cut them down while they were half dead from convulsive pains. God also drew masks over their faces so that they could not see plainly, and, taking one another for Israelites, slew their own people. With the fall of Heshbon, Israel came into possession of all the land of Sihon, with the exception of Jazer, and Moses therefore sent spies to that city. The men who he sent there, Caleb and Phinehas, were not only capable warriors, but also pious men. They said, "Moses once sent spies who brought great misfortune on all their generations. We will attack this city, trusting in God, and we are sure we will not perish because Moses has prayed for our welfare." They then attacked Jazer, conquered it, and on the day after Moses had sent them, they returned and informed him that they had conquered Jazer and slain its inhabitants. The giant Og. The war with Sihon took place in the month of Elul. In the following month of Tishri, they rested on account of the holy days, but immediately after these they sent out to battle against Og. This king did not hurry to his brother's aid, although he was only 1 day's distance, for he felt sure that Sihon could conquer Israel without his assistance. He erred in this, as in some other matters. In the War of the 4 Kings against the 5, it was Og who had brought to Abraham the news of his nephew Lot's bondage, assuming that Abraham would surely hurry to his kinsman's aid, be killed in battle, and thus enable Og to get possession of the beautiful Sarah. God, however, leaves no man unrewarded or unpunished. To reward him for hurrying to advise Abraham of Lot's captivity, God granted him life of 500 years, but he was eventually killed because it was only a wicked motive that had induced him to perform this service for Abraham. He did not, as he had hoped, gain Sarah, but was slain by her descendant Moses. The battle against Og took place in Edrei, the outskirts of which Israel reached about nightfall. On the following morning, however, Moses arose and prepared to attack the city, but looking toward the city wall, he cried in amazement, "Behold, in the night they have built a new wall." Moses did not see clearly in the misty morning, for there was no new wall, but only the giant Og, who sat on the wall with his feet touching the ground below. Considering Og's enormous stature, Moses' mistake was pardonable, for, as a gravedigger of later times related, Og's thigh bone alone measured more than 3 parasangs. Once, so records Abba Saul, I hunted a stag which fled into the thigh bone of a dead man. I pursued it and ran along 3 parasangs of the thigh bone, yet had not reached its end. This thigh bone, as was later established, was Og's. This giant never in all his days made use of a wooden chair or bed, as these would have broken down beneath his weight, but he sat on iron chairs and lay on iron beds. He was not only of gigantic build and strength, but of a width also that was completely out of proportion even with his height, for his breadth was 1/2 his height, whereas the normal proportion of breadth to height is about 1 to 3. In his youth, Og had been a slave to Abraham, who had received him as a gift from Nimrod, for Og is none other than Eliezer, Abraham's steward. One day, when Abraham rebuked him and shouted at him, Eliezer was so frightened that one of his teeth fell out, and Abraham fashioned out of it a bed for himself. Og daily devoured 1,000 oxen, or an equal number of other animals, and drank correspondingly, requiring daily not less than 1,000 measures of liquids. He remained in Abraham's service until Isaac's marriage, when Abraham gave him his freedom as a reward for having undertaken the labor of wooing Rebekah for his son. God also rewarded him in this world, that this giant might not lay claim to a reward in the world to come. He therefore made a king of him. During his reign he founded 60 cities that he surrounded with high walls, the lowest of which was not less than 60 miles in height. Moses now feared to wage war against Og, not only on account of his giant strength and huge size, which Moses had now witnessed with his own eyes, but he also thought, I am only 120 years old, whereas he is more than 500. Surely he could never have attained so great an age had he not performed meritorious deeds. Moses also remembered that Og was the only giant that had escaped the hand of Amraphel, and he perceived in this a token of God's special favor toward Og. Moses feared, moreover, that Israel in the recent war against Sihon might have committed sins, so that God would not now stand by them. The pious are always afraid of the consequences of sin, and therefore do not rely on the assurances God has made them. Hence Moses now feared to advance on Og, even though God had promised him aid against his enemies. God, however, said to him, "What is in your mind? His destruction has been decreed since the moment he looked with evil eyes on Jacob and his family when they arrived in Egypt." For even then God had said to Og, "O you wicked knave, why do you look on them with an evil eye? Truly your eye will burst, for you will fall into their hands." Og met his death in the following fashion. When he discovered that Israel's camp was 3 parasangs in circumference, he said, "I will now tear up a mountain of 3 parasangs and throw it on Israel's camp, and crush them." He did as he had planned, pulling up a mountain of 3 parasangs, laid it on his head, and came marching in the direction of the Israelite camp, to hurl it on them. But what did God do? He caused ants to perforate the mountain, so that it slipped from Og's head down to his neck, and when he attempted to shake it off, his teeth pushed out and extended to right and left, thus not letting the mountain pass lower. So now he stood there with the mountain covering his head, unable to throw it off. When Moses saw this, he took an axe 12 cubits long, leaped 10 cubits in the air, and dealt a blow to Og's ankle, which caused the giant's death. This was the end of the last of the giants, who was not only last in time, but also in significance, for despite his height and strength, he was the most insignificant of the giants who perished in the flood. With Og's death, all his lands fell to the lot of the Israelites, without another sword stroke. For God had so ordained it that all of Og's warriors were with him at his encounter with Israel, and after Israel had conquered these, only women and children remained in all the land. When Hadrian conquered Jerusalem, he boasted of his victory. Then Rabbi Johanan, the son of Zakkai, said to him, "Boast not of your victory over Jerusalem. Had not God conquered it for you, you should never have gained it." He then led Hadrian to a cave where he showed him the corpses of the Amorites, each of which was 18 cubits, and said, "When we were worthy of victory, these fell into our hands, but now, on account of our sins, you rule over us." The victory over Sihon was as great as the one over Pharaoh, and so was the victory over Og. Each of these victories was just as important as those over the 31 kings that Joshua later captured, and it would have behooved Israel to sing songs of praise to their Lord as they did after Pharaoh's destruction. David later made good this omission, for he intoned a song of praise and gratitude for the victory God gave Israel over Sihon and Og. Without direct assistance from God, these victories would not have been possible. But he sent hornets on them, and their destruction was irrevocable. 2 hornets pursued every Amorite. One bit one eye, the second the other, and the poison of these little creatures consumed those bitten by them. These hornets remained on the east side of the Jordan, and did not pursue Israel's march to the regions west. Nevertheless, they brought great havoc among the Canaanites. The hornets stood on the eastern bank of the Jordan and spat their venom across to the opposite bank, so that the Canaanites that were hit became blind and disarmed. When God promised Moses to send an angel to Israel, he declined the offer with the words, "If you do not go with us, I do not want to go." Then God replied, "You complain because I want to send an angel to assist you? As truly as you live, I will now send not even an angel, but a hornet to destroy the enemies of Israel. It is, however, for your sake alone that I deliver the enemy into Israel's hands, and not as if Israel deserved it through their own good deeds. Og's bed, fashioned out of ivory, that measured 9 arm lengths, taking the giant's arm as a standard, Og had preserved in the Ammonite city Rabbah, for he knew that Israel would penetrate neither to the land of the Ammonites nor of the Moabites, because God had prohibited them from coming too close to Lot's descendants. He likewise foretold them not to wage war with the Edomites. In this way Esau, kind to his father Isaac, was rewarded by not having his descendants, the Edomites, molested by Israel. God said to Israel, "In this world you will have no sway over the mountain Seir, Edom's realm, but in the future world, when you will be released, then you will obtain possession of it. Until then, however, beware of the sons of Esau, even when they fear you, much more so when you will dwell scattered among them." Moses' speech of admonition. As Abraham, before his death, spoke to his son Isaac, and Isaac to his son Jacob, and Jacob in turn to his sons, words admonishing them to walk in the ways of the Lord, so also Moses did not depart from this world without previously calling Israel to account for their sins, and admonishing them to observe the commandments of the Lord. Moses' speech of admonition had a greater effect than the revelation of the Decalogue on Sinai. For whereas Israel, shortly after having said on Sinai, "We will do according to what we have heard," transgressed by worshipping the golden calf, Moses' words of admonition had left a powerful impression on them, and he restored them to God and the Torah. God therefore said, "As a reward to you, because your words of exhortation have brought Israel to me, I will designate these words as yours, even though you spoke them only in execution of my command." Moses did not, however, make his speech of exhortation to the people until after the victory of Sihon and Og, for Moses thought, "Had I called them to account before these victories, they would have answered, 'He is trying to blame us, saying that because of our sins he is unable to lead us into the promised land against Sihon and Og, and is using our sins as an excuse.'" But after Moses had proven what he could do, he could safely venture to recall to the people their sins. He now assembled all classes of Israel, the nobles as well as the common people, saying to them, "I will now give you a severe rebuke for your sins, and if anyone has something to offer as an excuse, let him now say so." In this way he shut off the possibility of their saying later on, "Had we heard the words of the son of Amram, we would have answered each word fourfold and fivefold." Moses now recounted the 10 temptations with which they had tempted God. How at the Red Sea they had wished they had not followed him, and even turned back 3 stations on the way to Egypt. How even after the miracle that parted the Red Sea for them, they had so little faith in God as to say, "Just as on this spot we passed unharmed through the Red Sea, so also did the Egyptians pass in another spot." At Merah and at Rephidim they tested God on account of the scarcity of water, and as they twice rebelled against God on account of water, so also on account of manna. They infringed on the 2 laws God had given them in regard to manna, storing it from one day to the next, and going to gather it on the Sabbath, although God had strictly forbidden both. On account of their lust for flesh, they also twice transgressed, murmuring for flesh at the same time as they received manna, although manna completely satisfied their needs. And after God had granted their wish and sent them quails, they remained content for only a short time, and then again demanded quails, until God granted them that wish also. But the worst of all, Moses told them, was the worship of the golden calf. And not only that, but again in Paran, misled by the spies, you transgressed in desiring to make an idol, and under its guidance returned to Egypt. Moses then pointed out to them that it was owing to their sin that they had wandered about in the desert for 40 years, for otherwise God would have brought them to Palestine on the same day as he led them out of Egypt. He not only reproached Israel with the sins they had committed against God, but also with the evil they had worked against Moses himself, mentioning how they had thrown their infants into his lap, saying, "What food have you for these?" On this occasion it was evident how good and pious the nation was that stood before Moses, for all the sins he enumerated to them had been committed not by them, but by their fathers, all of whom had in the meantime died. Yet they were silent and made no answer to this severe reprimand their leader gave them. Moses did not, however, merely admonish the people to walk in the ways of the Lord, but he said to Israel, "I am near death. Whoever has learned from me a verse, a chapter, or a law, let him come to me now and learn it anew." Then he repeated all the Torah in the 70 languages of the world, that not Israel alone, but all the heathen people too, might hear the teachings of God. Balak, king of Moab. God allows nothing to stay unrewarded. Not even a respectable word remains without its reward. The older of Lot's 2 daughters called her son, that was conceived in guilt, Moab, by the father, whereas the younger, for the sake of decency, called her son Ammon, son of my people, and she was rewarded for her sense of propriety. For when Moses wanted to overrun the descendants of Lot with war, God said to him, "My plans differ from yours. 2 doves will spring from this nation, the Moabite Ruth and the Ammonite Naomi, and for this reason these 2 nations must be spared." The treatment God told Israel to accord these 2 nations was not, however, uniform. In regard to Moab, God said, "Do not trouble Moab, nor contend with them in battle," which meant that Israel was not to wage war against the Moabites, but they might rob them or reduce them to servitude. In regard to the sons of Ammon, on the other hand, God told Israel to show these descendants of Lot's younger daughter not even the slightest sign of hostility, or in any way to alarm them, so that Israel must not even show themselves in battle array before the Ammonites. Israel's hostile, though not warlike, attitude toward Moab inspired these people and their kings with great fear, so much so that they seemed to be strangers in their own land, fearing, as they did, they might have to share the same fate as the Egyptians, for the Israelites had come to Egypt as strangers, but in time had taken over possession of the land, so that the Egyptians had to rent their dwelling places from them. Their fear was still further increased by their belief that Israel would pay no attention to God's command not to wage war against them. This assumption of theirs was based on the fact that Israel had taken possession of the kingdoms of Sihon and Og, even though these had originally been part of Ammon's and Moab's possession. Heshbon, Sihon's capital city, had formerly belonged to Moab, but the Amorites, thanks to Balaam and his father Beor's support, had taken from Moab these and some other regions. The Amorites had hired these 2 sorcerers to curse Moab, with the result that the Moabites were terribly defeated in the war against Sihon. "Woe to you, Moab! You are undone, O people of Chemosh!" These and similar utterances were the ominous words that Balaam and his father employed against Moab. Chemosh was a black stone in the form of a woman that the Moabites worshipped as their god. As part of Moab passed into Sihon's possession, so did a part of Ammon fall into Og's hands, and because Israel had appropriated these lands, the Moabites feared they would take from them all their land. In great alarm, they therefore gathered together in their fortresses, in which they knew themselves to be safe from Israel's attacks. Their fear was really quite without foundation, for Israel never dreamed of transgressing God's command against waging war on Lot's descendants. They might without compunction keep the former provinces of Moab and Ammon, because they took them not from the Moabites, but from Sihon and Og, who had previously captured them. At this time the king of Moab was Balak, who was formerly a vassal of Sihon, and in that capacity was known as Zur. After Sihon's death he was chosen king, though he was not worthy of a rank so high, but favored by fortune he received royal dignity, a position that his father had never filled. Balak was a fitting name for this king, for he set about destroying the people of Israel, Therefore he was also called the son of Zippor, because he flew as swiftly as a bird to curse Israel. Balak was a great magician, who employed for his sorcery the following instrument. He constructed a bird with its feet, trunk, and head of gold, its mouth of silver, and its wings of bronze. And for a tongue he supplied it with the tongue of the bird Yaduah. The bird was now placed by a window where the sun shone by day and the moon by night, and there it remained for 7 days, throughout which burnt offerings were brought before it, and ceremonies performed. At the end of this week the bird's tongue would begin to move, and, if pricked by a golden needle, would divulge great secrets. It was this bird that had given to Balak all his occult lore. One day, however, a flame that suddenly leaped up burned the wings of the bird, which greatly alarmed Balak, for he thought that Israel's proximity had destroyed his instrument of sorcery. The Moabites, now perceiving that Israel conquered their enemies by supernatural means, said, "Their leader was bred in Midian. Let us therefore inquire of the Midianites of his characteristics." When the elders of Midian were consulted, they replied, "His strength abides in his mouth." Then the Moabites said, "We will oppose him with a man whose strength also lies in his mouth." And they determined to call on Balaam's support. The union of Moab and Midian establishes the truth of the proverb, "Weasel and cat had a feast, rejoicing over the flesh of the unfortunate dog." For there had always been hatred between Moab and Midian, but they united to bring ruin on Israel, just as Weasel and cat had united to put an end to their common enemy, the dog. Balaam, the heathen prophet. The man whom the Moabites and Midianites believed to be Moses' peer was none other than Laban, Israel's arch-enemy, who in the old days had wanted to root out Jacob and his family entirely, and who had later on incited Pharaoh and Amalek against the people of Israel to bring about their destruction. Hence, too, the name Balaam, devourer of nations, for he was determined to devour the nation of Israel. At this time Balaam was at the zenith of his power, for his curse had brought on the Midianites their defeat at the hands of Sihon, and his prophecy that his compatriot Balak should wear the royal crown had just been fulfilled, so that all the kings sent ambassadors to seek advice from him. He had gradually developed from an interpreter of dreams to a sorcerer, and had attained the still greater dignity of prophet, thus even surpassing his father, who had indeed been a prophet too, but not so notable a one as his son. God would not permit the heathens to have any grounds for excuses, so that they could not say in the future world, "You kept us far from you." For to them, as well as to Israel, he gave kings, sages, and prophets. But whereas the former showed themselves worthy of their high trust, the latter proved themselves unworthy. Both Solomon and Nebuchadnezzar were rulers over all the world. The former built the temple and composed many hymns and prayers. The latter destroyed the temple and cursed and blasphemed the Lord, saying, "I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High." Both David and Haman received great treasures from God, but the former employed them to secure a site for God's sanctuary, whereas the latter tried to destroy the whole nation. Moses was Israel's prophet, and Balaam was prophet of the heathens. But what a contrast between these two! Moses exhorted his people to keep from sin, whereas Balaam counseled the nations to give up their moral course of life and to become addicted to lewdness. Balaam was also different from Moses in his cruelty. Moses had such pity for the nations that misfortune among the heathens caused him suffering and sorrow, whereas Balaam was so cruel that he would destroy an entire nation without cause. Balaam's course of life and his actions show convincingly why God withdrew from the heathen the gift of prophecy. For Balaam was the last of the heathen prophets. Shem had been the first whom God had commissioned to communicate his words to the heathen. This was after the flood, when God had said to Shem, "Shem, Had my Torah existed among the previous 10 generations, it is possible I might not have destroyed the world. Go now and announce to the future nations of the earth my revelations. Ask them to accept my Torah. Throughout 400 years Shem went about as a prophet, but the nations of the earth did not heed him. The prophets that labored after him among the heathens were Job and his 4 friends, Eliphaz, Zophar, Bildad, and Elihu, as well as Balaam, all of whom were descendants of Nahor, Abraham's brother from his union with Milcah. In order that the heathens might not say, "If we had a prophet like Moses, we would have received the Torah," God gave them Balaam as a prophet, who in no way was inferior to Moses either in wisdom or in the gift of prophecy. Moses was indeed the greatest prophet among the Israelites, but Balaam was his peer among the heathens. But although Moses excelled the heathen prophet in that God called him without any previous preparation, the other could obtain divine revelations only through sacrifices. Still, Balaam had one advantage over the Israelite prophet. Moses had to pray to God to show him his ways, whereas Balaam was the man who could declare he knew the knowledge of the Most High. But because, in spite of his high prophetic dignity, Balaam had never done anything good or kind, but through his evil tongue had almost destroyed all the world, God vowed to his people that he would never exchange them for any other people or nation, and he would never permit them to dwell in any other land than Palestine. Next, Balak's messengers to Balaam. End part 66 of 95, TheLegendsOfTheJews.com.